So first we're going to look at the major regions of the brain and go over a few of the most prominent structures. This is the cerebrum, the thinking part of your brain, the brain that makes you who you are. You have two cerebral hemispheres, right and left. So this would be right hemisphere of the cerebrum. This is left hemisphere of the cerebrum. The cerebrum has a deep fissure that divides the two halves, the two hemispheres. This is called the longitudinal fissure. You can see that right down the middle. The cerebrum is also divided into lobes, and we can see the lobes on this brain nicely because they're color-coded. So this is frontal lobe here in reddish-orange. Parietal lobe is in purple. Temporal lobe, which goes all the way down here to that little finger, is all in yellow. And then here in the back part of the brain is your occipital lobe, which is in green on this brain. If we look here on the frontal and parietal lobes, you'll notice on this brain that you have a darker purple and a darker pink or red in this case. And that's showing you the pre and post central gyrus. Remember, the bumps on a brain are the gyri. Gyrus is singular, so all of these are gyrus. And those little depressions in between the gyri are called sulci or sulcus for singular. Some of these sulci and gyri are more important than others and more prominent. This sulci, for example, makes basically a coronal cut across the brain, dividing the frontal and parietal lobes, and it's called the central sulcus. A central sulcus divides frontal and parietal lobes. On either side of that sulcus, you have a gyrus that's very important. We talked about those in chapter 12. The one in front of the central sulcus, the precentral gyrus, is your primary motor cortex. The one behind the post-central gyrus is your primary somatosensory cortex. So very important gyri there. So that's why they're in different colors. So central sulcus, precentral gyrus, post-central gyrus, longitudinal fissure, right and left hemispheres. Now you also have a fissure that separates the cerebellum, which is here, from the cerebrum. That's called your transverse fissure. And you have a lateral sulcus right here, separating temporal from frontal and parietal. And this is your cerebellum. Did the low, okay. Okay, now we'll open this guy up and look on the inside. So now I've got a mid-sagittal cut of my brain. And we can still see continuation of what we were talking about on the outside structures. This is where that longitudinal fissure would come down, and it would stop because it's going to run into this structure right here called the corpus callosum. Now the corpus callosum is a tract of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of the brain together. So this is white matter here, your corpus callosum. And remember, your gray matter in the brain is going to be located in the cortex, and we'll see this on a different brain in a minute, cortex of the cerebellum, the cerebrum, excuse me, and then some of your deeper brain structures like your nuclei, which you can't really see on this brain. But this is your corpus callosum, the connection between your two hemispheres. These are some of those commissural fibers. This gyrus right above the corpus callosum is called the cingulate gyrus. It's part of the limbic system, which is why it's in orange. Cingulate gyrus kind of follows this corpus callosum in this C shape. Underneath the corpus callosum you have a kind of membrane structure called the septum pellucidum here that basically separates the two lateral ventricles. Now, usually on the brains you'll see the septum pellucidum on one side, this solid structure, and if you looked on the other side of this brain that's cut, you can see the space of the lateral ventricle. So remember, ventricles are spaces within the brain. This is the lateral ventricle, which is the space inside the cerebrum. You have one on each side of the cerebrum, and we'll look at a model of the ventricles in a minute. But this is the lateral ventricle. Cingulate gyrus, corpus callosum, lateral ventricle. On this side, cingulate gyrus, corpus callosum, septum pellucidum. If I poked a hole through that, I would go into the other lateral ventricle. Now right below the septum pellucidum, you have another C-shaped structure called the fornix. Okay, so cingulate gyrus, corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, and fornix. Okay, now we're going to look at the diencephalon. The diencephalon is in the middle of the brain, okay, very deep underneath the cerebrum. And this diencephalon consists of three basic structures. You've got the egg-shaped middle portion, which is the thalamus. That's your relay station. The thalamus, you have one on each side, and the two sides are connected to each other through a little adhesion, little tract of brain matter. It's called the interthalamic adhesion, or intermediate mass. Okay, looking a little closer at the diencephalon here, you can see the thalamus, the intermediate mass right there in the middle. Now we have the hypothalamus, which is this little triangular region below the thalamus. Hypo means below, thalamus, hypothalamus. And we have an epithalamus, epi meaning on the surface of, basically, or on the outside. So this little strip is the epithalamus. Now at the back of the epithalamus, you have a gland called the pineal gland, right here. And underneath the hypothalamus, you also have a gland, and that's the pituitary. So the pituitary would hang off right here underneath the epithalamus. I mean the hypothalamus, excuse me. Under the hypothalamus, you also have a bump called a mammillary body. So this is the mammillary body. It's actually continuous with the fornix, but you can see this underneath the hypothalamus. So mammillary body, and then this would be your pituitary hanging down here, and the pituitary hangs off of a stalk called the infundibulum, and we'll see that on another model. And then here, right in front of the infundibulum, is going to be the cross of your two optic nerves, called the optic chiasm. So you actually have three structures right in a row underneath the hypothalamus: mammillary body, infundibulum with the pituitary, and the optic chiasm. You can actually see the optic nerve coming in right here. Okay, so that's the diencephalon. Okay, now we'll look at the brainstem. One thing I forgot to mention about the diencephalon is that there will be space between the two sides of the diencephalon here, and this is all third ventricle. So lateral ventricles are in the cerebrum, third ventricle is surrounding the diencephalon. The fluid, the CSF, will flow down through the cerebral aqueduct to gain access to the fourth ventricle, which is right here between the cerebellum and the pons. So this is fourth ventricle. And then from there, it'll go down into the central canal of the spinal cord. So now we're going to look at the brainstem. So brainstem is basically from here to here. It's got three parts. This is the midbrain, pons, and then medulla oblongata here. The midbrain has a few structures that you need to know. You need to know the cerebral peduncle, which is essentially this portion of the midbrain here. If I turn this over, you can't see it real well on this brain, but it would be this part right here. We'll see it better on another one. And then behind that cerebral peduncle, now remember, peduncle is just a communication pathway. So this peduncle allows the cerebrum to communicate with the brainstem. That's all it does. Behind that, you have two bumps right beneath the pineal gland. And these two bumps you're only seeing on one side. You've got two bumps on the other side for a total of 4. These 4 bumps together are called the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora meaning body or bump in this case. Quad meaning 4, and Gemini, twins. Okay, so it's like saying the 4-bodied twin. So there's 4 bumps. Here's 2 of them. You have two that are superior and two that are inferior, and individually each bump is called a colliculus. Superior colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina, inferior colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina. Okay, so that's really just a naming issue. Up in the diencephalon, I also forgot to show you the commissures. And these commissures, again, are just communication pathways for the cerebrum. This is the anterior commissure. This is the posterior commissure. And on a lot of the brains, they'll be color-coded, so we'll see those again on a different model. Now if we look at the pons, right here, you have this kind of rounded portion of the pons. And the pons really, as far as landmarks for you guys, is just going to be a peduncle that you have to know that connects the pons to the cerebellum. And so if we look on the other side, we can see the cerebellum here. Here's the pons. Here's the communication here. So this is actually called the middle cerebellar peduncle. You actually have a superior cerebellar peduncle right here that connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. So the brainstem has three parts: midbrain, pons, medulla. There are three peduncles for the cerebellum, three cerebellar peduncles. 1, 2, 3. Those three peduncles allow communication with the midbrain, which is superior, with the pons, which is middle, and with the medulla oblongata, which is inferior. So superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, inferior cerebellar peduncle. Communication pathways for the brainstem, three parts to the cerebellum. Now that's pretty much it for the pons. We'll look at some cranial nerves that are on the pons, but as far as the medulla oblongata right here, the medulla has, again, a cerebellar peduncle here that's just inferior. And here on the front, it has the continuation of the pyramidal cells coming out of the motor cortex. And they kind of all run together in these two bumps on the front of the medulla, and we call these the medullary pyramids. These pyramidal tracts will cross to the other side at a place called the decussation. Now on this brain, the decussation is like little hash marks. I don't know if you can see it there, but this would be the medullary pyramid, and this would be the decussation, representing the decussation. There's also a structure on this side of the medulla, and some of the models it's color-coded, so we'll see it again a different way, but this little bump here on the medulla oblongata is called the medullary olive. You have one on each side. And this olive, it contains a nucleus that does some different types of functioning, but you can use this anatomically as a landmark for some of your cranial nerves, and I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, now we'll look at the cerebellum. Cerebellum is very basic. The folds on the cerebellum are called folia because when you cut it in cross-section, it looks like leaves. The middle portion of the cerebellum is called the vermis, and we'll see a better vermis on another brain. But if you look at this, you can tell that this little piece is cut, whereas this part is not. And that's because this little middle structure that you've cut through is actually the vermis itself. It's just like a little wormy structure in between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. When you cut through the cerebellum, you see a tree-like structure of white matter called the arbor vitae. Let's see if we can see this on a different one. Arbor vitae means tree of life, so this looks like a tree. So that's why it's called arbor vitae. So you can see the cerebellum here. This was your vermis, and this is your arbor vitae. The flocculonodular lobes are right here. Anterior lobe, posterior lobe, vermis here. And we'll see those better on a different cerebellum in a minute.